Welcome to Civil War Digital Digest. I'm Will. Well, in a previous episode, we talked about the monitors in the United States Navy during the Civil War, and historian and naval reservist Andrew Roscoe is back with us again. I guess where I want to start today, Andy, were the monitors the only ironclad thing in the Civil War water?
No. I mean, famously, the Monitor had the Merrimack. That's the other side of the coin. There is this casemate ram ship that the Confederates had, the CSS Virginia. But there's a lot of other designs that are out there that probably aren't as famous or well known to people that cover a whole plethora of different ways that innovators took to try to apply steam and iron and modern artillery to these ships during Civil War combat. Okay, so on the United States side, who got to make the decisions of who got built and who didn't? Generally, you're looking at the Navy Department. At the time, there's no Department of Defense. There's a War Department and a Navy Department. And Gideon Welles is Lincoln's Secretary of the Navy. He's interesting because he's a political appointment like any service secretary, but he actually is a fantastic Secretary of the Navy. And he makes some really important decisions that really allow the Navy to make some innovations and put different classes in during the course of the war, and really gave some different ideas chances to see if they were successful or not. Okay, so is he making these decisions himself, or does he have a board of officers working for him? So in 1861, he creates what's called the Ironclad Board. And it's a series of senior officers, and their charge is to look at different designs for ironclads and to pick the most viable designs, to award contracts for them, and to see them into service, and eventually to make choices of what is going to go into full-time production based on their success. Great. Well, obviously the Monitor is successful. We've done a whole nother episode on it. If you want to hit on that briefly, but let's talk about what the other options that got to sea were. Yeah, and interestingly, the Monitor is not the original choice of this board. Originally, they were going to pick two designs. One is the USS New Ironsides. It's a very conventional design in that it's an all steam design. It does have sails and masts to take it to its station on blockade duty, and then it would strike those below and use steam only in the local area. But it's a large casemate type. It carries 14 guns on board, so it's about 4,000 tons. So it's a pretty large ship. The other one is a very lightly armored ship called the Galena. The Galena is a true ironclad. It's a wooden sloop that's covered in thin layers of iron armor. How'd it do? The Galena has a very unsuccessful career as an ironclad. Famously, it was in the Battle of Drury's Bluff on the James River in May 1862. And during the battle, Drury's Bluff, the Confederate batteries up on top of this bluff, the Monitor, which was there, couldn't raise its guns enough to hit this. So the only Union ship that was really in combat was the Galena. And unfortunately, it was brutalized during the fight. The Union commander, John Rodgers, managed to keep the ship in the fight the whole time, but it took tremendous damage. Its armor was punctured multiple times, and he was able to salvage the ship. But eventually, it was a failure. They stripped the armor off it, and it actually just got used as a wooden warship for the rest of the war. Okay, well, let's go to the New Ironsides. How did they do? The New Ironsides, it's a very powerful ship, and it ended up as the flagship for the Southern Atlantic Blockading Squadron for most of the war. So the famous Union naval attack on Charleston Harbor in 1863, it's the flagship going in with that. It could take a beating. It was a very combat-worthy ship. Its biggest problems were handling. A lot of the ironclads in the Civil War were dealing with the very limits of steam technology, and the engines are just not powerful enough to move these ships quickly enough through the water. And so because of that, they have large turning radiuses. It's very hard to maneuver them in combat. But that being said, the New Ironsides is a more conventional design than the Monitors, but still a very successful one. So we see that these three things come out of the Ironclad Board, the Monitor, the New Ironside, and the Galena. Is this the only design being done by the United States Navy? No. Interestingly, at the same time that all this is going on, is what is generally called the city-class ironclads are getting built in the Western rivers. So John Rodgers, who commanded the Galena later in the war, early in the war, he is the first commander of the Western River Squadron, and he's the one that begins the Timberclads that we talked about in a different episode. He also, working with naval constructor Samuel Pooke, comes up with this idea for the city class. And They're relatively lightly armored by the standard of later in the war, but they carry 13 guns apiece. They're casemate vessels, and they've got a large paddle wheel that's aft. And the idea is that they're armored forward, but in the aft, they're actually relatively unarmored. So it makes them a little bit precarious to be in. However, they actually put an excellent combat record. The naval contractor James Eads out of St. Louis builds most of them. They're named after different cities: St. Louis, Cairo, Carindon, different places like that. And they're actually the first ironclads to fight during the Civil War. Most people think about the Monitor and the Merrimack. They forget that these ships are fighting at Forts Henry and Donelson a month before that.
And of course, the Cairo you can still see at Vicksburg the excavation of.
Yes, the Cairo was involved in a joint operation in the Yazoo River in 1862 and 3. It sunk on a mine out there, and during the 1950s and 60s, it was actually excavated, preserved, and reassembled. And if you go to Vicksburg National Military Park, you can see it, which is tremendous to get to see a ship like that and to really get an idea of its scope and scale.
Okay, well, talk to me a little bit, as we've talked about the navies, we've talked about the metrics of broadside, of tonnage, and of draft. Obviously, these are riverine craft, but talk to me a little bit about the City class and those metrics.
So in terms of broadside, they carry 13 guns. They actually carried a lot of older Army garrison guns from the northern forts, which is interesting. A lot of like 42 pounders and 32 pounders. But they're very broad. They're in the 50s foot. They're about 52 feet wide, which means that because they're so wide, they can distribute their weight over a larger area, which means they only take 6 foot of depth of draft, which actually is great for the western rivers. So they're relatively, they have a decent armor, a pretty good armament, and they have low draft. So they're able to go into all these places that even the riverine monitors can't go, because they can go into bayous and places like that. So they're very versatile craft because of that. And it's interesting that they're truly designed for riverine operations and really maximize the lessons of the American commercial efforts on the Mississippi, Ohio, Missouri rivers over the last 40 years.
Fantastic. Well, you see the American Navy working with the Ironclad Board and with City class. How does the young Confederacy go ahead and respond to this?
So the Confederates put all of their money into one general design. What you see is the Virginia is what we call a casemate design. It has a larger hull, and then it has an armored casemate sitting on top of the hull. The Virginia itself obviously was originally the USS Merrimack. It was captured when Hampton Roads fell in Norfolk Naval Yard. And John Brooke and John Porter, Confederate naval officers, worked on the conversion. One of the problems the Virginia had, it was built on a frigate. It has a very deep draft because it was built on a frigate hull, but it also has a very large casemate. It carries 10, 11 guns. That's a lot of weight to push down. So the lessons out of it, because the Virginia was lost because it was too heavy to go upriver, is the Confederates start to build smaller casemates where it's only carrying 4 or 6 guns, and therefore they have lower draft. They're more versatile in a coastal environment. But because of how the Confederacy is, it's individual designers in individual areas coming up with it. The constructor who's working out of New Orleans might have very little to do with the constructor who's working in Savannah. Even though they're both coming up with something that generally looks similar, there's very little commonality between those designs, and like nothing that we would call a class or anything. They're just all one-off designs based a lot on the material that's available in an area. The armor could vary differently. Is it railroad iron? Is it rolled iron? It's a lot of improvisation, as are a lot of things with the Confederacy.
Okay, well, in a previous episode, we talked about how the Confederate commerce raiders did really well against the American whaling fleet. How do the Confederate rams do generally? Generally,
they are not worth the effort for the Confederacy. And it's interesting that the Virginia has this great fight against the Monitor, but any other time that you see these single ships going out there, they might have individual successes, but generally they're not worth the effort. The CSS Atlanta famously was captured in Wassaw Sound. The CSS Tennessee during the Battle of Mobile Bay is captured, and it's used to help reduce the rest of Mobile. The ones on the Mississippi River, they might have individual successes, but when the whole Union fleet and their ironclads were mastered, the Union ironclads, there's more of them. They're better equipped, better officered. They were just usually able to overwhelm the Confederate ironclads. Confederates were never able to mass enough in one place for them to be effective. There's individual examples like the CSS Albemarle that was able to damage some U.S. ships, but in a special operations raid, Lieutenant Commander Cushing was able to blow it up.
Okay. Well, we've talked about technology so much as we talk about the Navy, things advancing. Let's talk about things that are very well known today, but maybe there's more to the story. I say the name Hunley. Most people in the United States know it's one of the first submarines. It's a Confederate sub. Obviously, we're working on restoring it. Let's use that as a way to get into really advanced technology at sea.
Sure. The Hunley is it's a really interesting story of, it's a ill-fated ship. It killed 3 crews, including the crew on its first combat voyage. But it was a successful combat craft using a spar torpedo, which is a long wooden spar. It has a torpedo at the end. It was able to sink the USS Housatonic, which is a sloop of war. It's a considerable ship that it sank. This wasn't a gunboat. This was a pre-war sloop of war. A sloop of war it was able for a very small investment to kill a very big target. Unfortunately, in that attack, the Hunley sank. But it opened the way that this is a predecessor and really started to show people that submarines for a very small investment could make massive changes. And you see 60 years later is 1914, and you look at the German investment in Untersee boats and what they were able to do. I mean, the reason the US enters the war is because of the unrestricted submarine warfare that would be unthinkable in the Civil War. But just, it's interesting to see the impact from this one design moving forward.
Okay, if this one design, is the Hunley the only thing that we should be looking at here?
No, there's a Confederate design for something called the David. It's a torpedo craft. And the idea of this is it's a semi-submersible craft. It's mostly submerged. It's still steam powered. So what you would see is basically a person or a couple people on the top of what looks like a log with a smokestack coming out. But again, it would have a spar torpedo on it. But these craft are very interesting because there's almost nothing to them. They're relatively fast, they're relatively maneuverable, and that means now that you have a very small surface ship that has a very big punch, that if one of these gets through, it's going to sink almost any ship. That as the 1800s go on and these ships continue to develop, these torpedo boats call for a whole new class of Navy ships to counter them. We come up with the torpedo boat destroyers, which entire job is to protect the battle line from these ships. And of course, that's the genesis of our modern destroyers.
I've never heard the name David before. I have heard Hunley. How does the David do, and do we see more than one of them?
The David itself ends up being captured during the course of the war, but it's really the entire concept of it. There are whole fleets or whole squadrons of these at various southern ports. At Savannah and Charleston, places like that, where they're used mostly as a deterrent because the North doesn't want to push too far into a harbor, knowing that they could be swarmed by these ships. But they certainly have an impact on Union naval tactics because they know the Confederates have this and they have to be respectful of this weapon.
Okay, great. Well, we've talked about a whole variety of things from blue water to riverine to what's really specialty craft. As we look at all these other armored things, how do we put them together? What do we say about the Civil War navies as looking at these ships?
I think when you look at this whole spectrum of armored and specialized craft, you really see it's a great display of the innovation that this war created. Because before the war, you look at everything was very, very conservative and very limited in terms of how it was descended from previous ships. This really opened the floodgates for a lot of different inventors to put their ideas into the naval realm. And there's some things that come out of it that you see definite traces of in today's Navy and how it moved forward. And it certainly showed the way forward for naval designers into the late 1800s.
Give me an example of that trace you see today when you're serving.
I'd say today the idea that being inside a ship all day. When we talked about the monitors, we talked about how the crew wanted to be up on deck. Being on deployment in the Navy today, I know people who go days without going outside. And it's interesting that even on a ship, you start to feel a little bit like you're in a submarine, even though you could go outside, just because everything you do is inside the ship. And it's not like the Age of Sail where if you were a part of the crew, you were climbing up into the mast to go into the rigging and work the sails. And that, in the Civil War, you start to see that going away, where now it becomes about working down the engine room and shoveling coal, or, start to see that emphasis on machinery and engineering and steam and things like that, as opposed to natural forces like wind. And
becomes a change of perspective for the average enlisted man.
Yes. And the ratings that come out of the Civil War, and the Navy, all of our jobs are about ratings. You start to see those machinist mates and things like that. They can all draw their lineage back to sometime around the Civil War as the Navy's beginning to implement those STEAM and engineering ratings.
Well, Andy, thanks for sharing your perspective with us, both as a historian and as someone who lives 150 years downstream of these men back then. Thanks for spending your time with us at Civil War Digital Digest. It's connections like this that make history more real to us. Hope you found a little bit here, and we'll see you in a few weeks.